Whispers echoed through Oak Ridge when a decorated Navy SEAL bought the cursed Holloway estate for a single dollar bill. Locals laughed, calling it a toxic wasteland. They stopped laughing when his retired combat dog clawed through the mud, unearthing a rusted steel hatch, hiding 11 million reasons they were wrong. Caleb Mitchell did not return from his 4th deployment looking for a parade. After 12 years operating in the world's most unforgiving environments, the former Navy SEAL came back to the States with a permanent limp, a chest full of shrapnel scars, and a desperate need for absolute silence. The noise of civilization, the traffic, the chatter, the relentless pace of modern life felt like a physical weight pressing against his skull. He wanted a piece of earth where nobody would bother him, even if that earth was broken. He found it at the back of a damp, poorly lit county courthouse in rural Oregon. The property was officially listed as Tract 44, but every local in Oak Ridge knew it as the old Holloway farm. Decades ago, it had belonged to Arthur Holloway, a paranoid banking executive who retreated from society in the late 1980s. Holloway was convinced the global economy was going to collapse overnight. He spent years obsessively building, digging, and hoarding on his 40-acre plot before dying in a fiery wreck on Interstate 5. Since he had no heirs, the bank seized the property. They tore apart the farmhouse, looking for the millions Holloway had supposedly withdrawn from his accounts, but they found absolutely nothing. Over the next 30 years, the abandoned farm became a dumping ground. Teenagers threw parties in the collapsing barn, illegal contractors dumped toxic construction waste in the fields, and the harsh Pacific Northwest weather rotted the remaining structures into a dangerous maze of splintered wood and rusted nails. The county eventually took possession due to decades of unpaid taxes, but they couldn't give the land away. It was considered an environmental hazard, a massive liability that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars just to clear. When the property came up at the county tax auction, the starting bid was set at a ceremonial $1. The room, filled with local investors and opportunistic developers, remained dead silent. Caleb, sitting in the back row with his retired military working dog, Sarge, slowly raised his numbered paddle. "I have a bid of $1, Mayor Thomas Gable said, adjusting his glasses, assuming it was a prank. "Do I hear 2? Anyone?" The room erupted into snickering. Richard Sterling, a wealthy local real estate developer known for paving over family farms to build strip malls, turned around in his front row seat. He looked Caleb up and down, taking in the faded flannel shirt, the heavy boots, and the quiet, imposing Belgian Malinois resting at his feet. "You're buying a landfill, son," Sterling called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "You'd better have deep pockets and a hazmat suit." Caleb didn't blink. He just stared Sterling down with the cold, unreadable expression that had kept him alive in places Sterling couldn't even point to on a map. The auctioneer slammed his gavel. For $1 single plus a $50 processing fee, Caleb Mitchell became the proud owner of 40 acres of poisoned, ruined earth. The town's pity was immediate and suffocating. When Caleb went into the local diner, the waitress, a kind older woman named Brenda Higgins, would slide him an extra slice of pie on the house, whispering that her nephew had also struggled to adapt after returning from overseas. The hardware store owner gave him steep discounts on tools, clearly believing Caleb was a disturbed veteran, engaging in a manic, doomed project. The reality of the farm was even worse than the rumors. When Caleb and Sarge first drove up the overgrown, washed-out driveway, the smell of decaying wood, stagnant water, and old chemical runoff was overpowering. The main house was entirely unsalvageable. The roof had caved in, crushing the interior into a moldy pile of rubble. The only structure left standing was a small, corrugated metal shed near the edge of the property line, which Caleb spent his first week insulating and patching just to have a dry place to sleep. For a month, Caleb's life was a grueling loop of physical labor. He woke before dawn, strapped on a pair of heavy leather gloves, and began dragging away debris by hand. He rented a chainsaw to clear the dead timber and used a rusted wheelbarrow to haul away tires, broken glass, and rotting drywall. It was agonizing work that made his old injuries scream in protest, but the physical pain quieted his mind. Out here, with his hands in the dirt and the wind in the trees, he he could finally breathe. Sarge, however, was not at peace. The 70-pound Malinois had served 3 tours with Caleb as an explosives detection dog. Sarge was a highly tuned instrument, trained to sniff out microscopic traces of danger in chaotic environments. Since arriving at the Holloway farm, the dog had been acting increasingly erratic. He refused to patrol the perimeter, instead obsessing over a massive, overgrown mound of earth directly behind the collapsed remains of a dairy silo. Caleb initially ignored the behavior. He assumed the dog was tracking a family of raccoons or smelling the residual chemicals from the illegal dumping. But as the weeks wore on, Sarge's fixation intensified. He would sit at the base of the mound for hours, staring intently at the dirt, occasionally letting out a low, vibrating growl. Then came the visit from Richard Sterling. Caleb was wrestling a rusted tractor axle out of the mud when Sterling's pristine luxury SUV rolled up the driveway. The developer stepped out, wearing expensive boots that he clearly didn't want to get dirty. "Mitchell, right?" Sterling said, waving a hand in front of his face to ward off the smell of stagnant water. "I drove by to see how the reclamation project was going. Looks like you're losing the war." "Property's private, Sterling," Caleb said, leaning against his crowbar. Sarge immediately stepped to Caleb's side, the fur on his spine standing straight up. "Look, let's be adults here," Sterling said, pulling a checkbook from his jacket. "You bought a nightmare because you didn't know any better. The county wants this land cleared, and you obviously don't have the capital to do it. I need an access road for a new subdivision I'm building on the adjoining acreage. I'll give you $500 for the deed right now. You walk away with a 500% profit. Go buy a nice little condo in town. Get out of this filth." Caleb looked at the checkbook, then looked around at the broken landscape he was slowly bringing back to life. It wasn't much, but it was his. "The gate's behind you," Caleb said softly. "Make sure you close it on your way out." Sterling scoffed, pocketing his checkbook. "You're a fool, Mitchell. When the county hits you with fines for the environmental hazards, don't come crying to me." As Sterling's SUV sped away, kicking up a trail of gravel, Sarge broke away from Caleb's side. The dog sprinted directly back to the mound behind the silo, barking frantically, tearing at the earth with his front paws as if his life depended on it. Caleb sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead. Whatever was under that hill, it was time to dig it out. The Pacific Northwest is notorious for its sudden, punishing weather shifts, and that evening, the sky bruised purple before unleashing a torrential downpour. The rain fell in sheets, instantly turning the 40 acres of exposed dirt into a treacherous, slipping sea of mud. Caleb retreated to his metal shed, drying Sarge off with an old towel and turning up the small propane heater. Around 2 a.m., a crack of thunder shook the shed so violently it rattled Caleb's teeth. He sat up on his cot, instantly awake, his military instincts kicking in. But it wasn't the thunder that put him on edge. It was the sudden, frantic scratching at the corrugated metal door. Sarge was throwing his entire body weight against the door, whining in a high, distressed pitch. Caleb grabbed his heavy waterproof flashlight and threw open the latch. Before he could grab the collar, the Malinois darted out into the freezing, driving rain. "Sarge, heel!" Caleb shouted, grabbing his waterproof jacket and plunging into the storm. He found the dog at the mound behind the collapsed silo. The torrential rain had caused a miniature landslide, washing away decades of packed topsoil, dead vines, and illegally dumped garbage. Sarge was in the middle of the mudslide, digging with a terrifying, singular focus. The dog's paws were caked in thick clay, but he wouldn't stop, throwing dirt out between his hind legs in a desperate frenzy. Caleb slid down the slick embankment, wrapping his arms around the dog's chest to pull him back. "Easy, buddy. Stop." As Caleb wrestled the heavy dog away, he swept his flashlight over the area Sarge had been attacking. The beam cut through the heavy rain and reflected off something unnatural. It wasn't the dull grey of a buried rock, nor was it the flimsy rust of an old car part. It was smooth, dark, and perfectly geometrically straight. Caleb let go of Sarge, telling the dog to stay. He dropped to his knees in the freezing mud and used his bare hands to wipe away the thick clay. His fingers met cold, hard metal. Not scrap metal, dense, military-grade steel. His heart rate spiked. His first terrible thought was unexploded ordnance. Given the random junk dumped here over the years, finding an old artillery shell wasn't impossible. He leaned in closer, wiping away more mud, his flashlight trembling slightly in the biting cold. As the rain washed the surface clean, the shape revealed itself. It was a massive, circular hatch, nearly 4 feet in diameter, set perfectly flush into a thick slab of reinforced concrete that had been completely buried beneath the artificial hill. In the dead center of the steel hatch was a heavy, recessed wheel, a locking mechanism straight out of a submarine or a nuclear fallout shelter. Caleb sat back on his heels, the rain pounding against his hood. Arthur Holloway's paranoia, the rumors of the missing fortune, the bank's inability to find a basement. They hadn't found it because Holloway hadn't put his vault in the house. He had buried it beneath a mountain of dirt on the far edge of the property, masking the construction as a farming silo foundation. For the next 3 hours, Caleb forgot about the cold, the rain, and his aching joints. He retrieved 2 heavy-duty shovels and a pickaxe from the shed. Working by the beam of his flashlight, he systematically cleared the perimeter of the hatch. The engineering was staggering. The concrete pad surrounding the steel door was at least 3 feet thick, poured seamlessly to prevent water seepage. The steel of the hatch itself was coated in a specialized anti-corrosive industrial polymer, which was why it hadn't rusted away into nothing after 40 years in the wet Oregon soil. By dawn, the rain had reduced to a steady drizzle. Caleb stood over the fully exposed hatch, his chest heaving, his hands blistered. Sarge sat obediently at the edge of the concrete pad, his ears perked forward, watching intently. Caleb grabbed a long iron crowbar, sliding it through the spokes of the locking wheel for leverage. He braced his boots against the concrete, took a deep breath, and threw his entire body weight against the bar. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The wheel felt fused, welded shut by time and pressure. Caleb let out a guttural yell, putting every ounce of his remaining strength into his legs and shoulders. With a deafening metallic crack that echoed across the empty farm, the locking mechanism gave way. Caleb spun the wheel, the heavy gears grinding in protest. 5 full rotations later, the wheel stopped with a heavy thud. He gripped the thick handle on the edge of the hatch and heaved upward. The door, balanced on a counterweighted hydraulic hinge, hissed as the pressurized seal broke. The scent that wafted up wasn't the smell of rot or dead earth. It was the distinct, sterile smell of dry, recycled air and oiled machinery. Caleb shined his flashlight down into the abyss. It wasn't a simple dirt cellar. A heavy steel ladder bolted to a concrete wall descended roughly 20 feet down into a reinforced corridor. At the bottom, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, Caleb could see a secondary set of security doors, thick glass, and the dull gleam of polished metal. He looked at Sarge. The dog wasn't growling anymore. He was just looking down into the hole, waiting for the command. Caleb reached down to his belt, ensuring his tactical knife was secured, and swung his leg over the edge of the hatch. He had bought a toxic wasteland for $1. He was about to find out exactly what Arthur Holloway thought was worth burying inside it. The descent into the earth felt like stepping out of the Pacific Northwest and into a Cold War submarine. The 20-foot steel ladder was slick with condensation, but the rungs held firm. Above him, Sarge paced the perimeter of the concrete pad, his sharp silhouette framed by the grey, pre-dawn sky, keeping watch over the exposed hatch. When Caleb's boots finally hit the concrete floor, he swept his flashlight down the subterranean corridor. It was astonishingly dry. Arthur Holloway had not merely dug a hole, he had engineered a fully self-sustaining microenvironment. Thick, rubberized cables ran along the ceiling, leading to industrial-grade dehumidifiers that had long since lost power. Yet their heavy chemical desiccants had remarkably preserved the air quality. At the end of the short hallway stood the final barrier, a massive Mosler Bank vault door, the kind usually reserved for Federal Reserves. Caleb's heart sank. If this door was locked, getting through it would require shaped charges and a specialized demolition team tools he no longer had access to. He approached the heavy steel door, illuminating the massive combination dial. Then, he noticed the deadbolt mechanism. It was disengaged. Holloway had been a man consumed by paranoia, trusting no one and anticipating a global collapse. When he died in that fiery car crash on Interstate 5 30 years ago, he had likely been returning to the farm, not fleeing it. He hadn't locked the vault because he was actively moving things into it. Caleb gripped the primary locking lever. It required him to plant both feet on the concrete and pull with his entire core, his muscles burning as the rusted internal gears fought him. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy steel pins retracted. The door swung inward with a heavy, pneumatic sigh. Caleb stepped into the main chamber. He clicked on a secondary, wide-beam lantern he'd brought down with him, bathing the room in stark white light. He stopped breathing. The room was roughly 30 by 40 feet, lined from floor to ceiling with heavy-duty metal shelving. It wasn't a bunker meant for living. There were no cots, no rations, no water tanks. It was a tomb for wealth. On the left wall, neatly stacked on heavy wooden pallets, were dozens of olive-drab aluminum Halliburton cases. Caleb knelt beside the nearest one, popping the heavy metal latches. Inside, vacuum-sealed in thick plastic, were rows of gleaming, heavy ingots. Gold. They were 1 kilogram Credit Suisse bullion bars, stamped with their serial numbers and purity ratings. He opened another case. Solid silver American Eagle coins, thousands of them, still sealed in their original United States Mint monster boxes. On the right side of the vault, waterproof Pelican cases held towering stacks of currency. But it wasn't modern cash, subject to inflation. Holloway had hoarded pre-1933 gold certificates and pristine stacks of high-denomination bearer bonds, perfectly preserved in the climate-controlled vacuum. But the real twist wasn't the money. It was sitting on a simple metal desk at the very back of the vault. Caleb walked over to the desk, illuminating a leather-bound ledger and a stack of manila folders. The top folder was labeled in thick red ink, Sterling Development, Blackmail. Caleb opened the file. Inside were original blueprints of Tract 44, bank statements, and a series of letters. As Caleb read through the documents, the tragic history of the Holloway farm and the hostility of the town suddenly snapped into a chilling, crystalline focus. Richard Sterling, the arrogant developer who had offered Caleb $500 to walk away, wasn't just an opportunistic local businessman. The documents revealed that Sterling's father, Warren Sterling, had been Holloway's financial partner in the 1980s. Warren had discovered Holloway's paranoia and his plan to liquidate their shared assets into untraceable physical gold. A handwritten journal entry from Holloway, dated just 2 days before his fatal car crash, sent a shiver down Caleb's spine. Warren knows about the farm. He tried to force my car off the ridge tonight. I'm moving the last of the Swiss assets into the silo vault. If anything happens to me, Warren did it. He will try to take the land. Caleb stared at the page. The car crash on Interstate 5 hadn't been an accident. It was murder. But Warren Sterling hadn't found the vault. When the bank seized the property, the Sterlings were kept out. Over the years, as the land transferred to the county, Richard Sterling took over his father's dark legacy. The illegal toxic dumping that made the farm worthless? It wasn't random contractors. Receipts and surveillance logs in Holloway's desk proved it was Sterling Development deliberately poisoning the topsoil, turning the property into an EPA nightmare. Sterling was intentionally keeping the land's value at zero, terrifying any potential buyers, while he quietly lobbied to buy the condemned land from the county for pennies, giving him full legal rights to excavate the vault. And then, a stubborn, quiet Navy SEAL had walked into an auction and bought Sterling's $11 million inheritance for a single dollar bill. A low, deep bark echoed down the concrete shaft. It was Sarge. The bark wasn't his standard alert. It was the sharp, aggressive, repetitive warning of an imminent threat. Caleb shoved the ledger and the Sterling file into his waterproof jacket. He killed the lantern, grabbed his flashlight, and sprinted for the ladder. The ghost of Arthur Holloway had waited 30 years for justice, but Caleb Mitchell was going to have to fight to deliver it. Caleb scrambled up the steel rungs, emerging from the hatch just as the morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds. The air was crisp, but the vibrating hum of heavy diesel engines shattered the silence. Rolling up the muddy, washed-out driveway was a yellow Caterpillar D6 bulldozer, followed closely by a heavy-duty pickup truck. Richard Sterling wasn't wearing an expensive suit today. He stepped out of the truck wearing a canvas jacket, flanked by three massive, heavily tattooed men carrying iron pipes and a 1-2 gauge shotgun. Sterling had seen the lights from his adjacent property. He had seen the mudslide. He knew the grave was open. "Mitchell!" Sterling yelled, his voice cracking with panic desperation. He pointed toward the exposed concrete pad. "Get away from that hatch. That property belongs to my family. We have the historical deed rights." Caleb stood firmly in front of the open vault, his boots planted in the mud. Sarge stood right beside him, a low, terrifying growl vibrating in his chest, his eyes locked on the man with the shotgun. "I read the files, Sterling," Caleb shouted back, his voice remarkably calm, projecting across the clearing. "I read your father's letters. I know about a crash. And I know you've been dumping neurotoxins on this land for 10 years to keep the county away." Sterling's face went pale, then contorted into violent rage. He turned to the man operating the bulldozer. "Plow him under! Fill the hole! Do it now!" The bulldozer's engine roared, black smoke belching from its exhaust stack as the massive steel blade lowered to the mud, surging forward toward Caleb and the open vault. The three hired thugs fanned out, advancing with their weapons drawn. They expected a terrified farmer. They got a Tier 1 operator. Caleb didn't retreat. He reached to his side, unholstering the flare gun he used for signaling in the deep woods. He aimed directly at the bulldozer's exposed air intake and fired. The blinding red phosphorus flare ignited the oily grill of the machinery, filling the cab with thick, choking, crimson smoke. The operator panicked, slamming the brakes and bailing out of the cab, coughing violently into the mud. "Take him!" Sterling screamed to the men. The man with the shotgun raised the barrel, but he never even found the trigger. "Sarge, fast!" Caleb commanded. The Belgian Malinois launched like a 70-pound heat-seeking missile. Sarge cleared the hood of the wrecked tractor and hit the shotgun-wielding thug square in the chest. The man flew backward into the mud, screaming as the dog's jaws locked relentlessly onto his heavy canvas jacket, pinning him entirely to the ground. The second thug swung his iron pipe at Caleb's head. Caleb ducked smoothly beneath the arc, stepping into the man's guard. With brutal, efficient muscle memory, Caleb delivered a devastating palm strike to the man's jaw, instantly shutting off his lights. As the man crumpled, Caleb swept the legs of the third attacker, locking him into a paralyzing joint submission on the wet ground before he could even register the counterattack. In less than 20 seconds, the assault was over. Sterling stood frozen by his pickup truck, his eyes wide with horror as he realized the catastrophic mistake he had just made. He scrambled for the driver's side door, but Caleb was already there. Caleb grabbed Sterling by the collar of his jacket and slammed him hard against the side of the truck. "You should have kept your $500, Caleb whispered, his voice ice cold. In the distance, the wail of police sirens began to echo through the valley. Caleb had called Sheriff Wade Harrison the second he recognized the combination lock on the vault door hours earlier, knowing exactly what kind of attention buried treasure brought. 4 squad cars tore up the driveway, lights flashing. Sheriff Harrison stepped out, his hand on his duty weapon, taking in the chaotic scene. The smoking bulldozer, the groaning men in the mud, Sarge pinning a terrified thug, and Caleb holding a trembling Richard Sterling against a truck. "Mitchell, what the hell is going on here?" the sheriff demanded. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled the waterproof ledger and the blackmail file from his jacket and handed it to the sheriff. "I found Arthur Halloway's vault, and I found the man who's been poisoning your county." The fallout was swift and absolute. Based on the documents inside the vault, the FBI and the EPA descended on Oak Ridge. Richard Sterling was arrested on charges ranging from armed assault and illegal dumping to corporate racketeering. The investigation into Arthur Halloway's death was officially reopened, tearing down the Sterling family's corrupt empire overnight. As for the vault, the state attempted a brief legal inquiry, but the law was ironclad. Caleb had bought the property outright at a county tax auction, free of any liens. Under Oregon state property laws, the contents of the land belonged exclusively to the deed holder. Gregory Pierce, a highly respected federal appraiser, spent a week cataloging the contents of the subterranean bunker. Between the Credit Suisse gold bars, the uncirculated silver, and the rare historical currency, the final appraisal came in at exactly $11.4 million. The town of Oak Ridge never looked at Caleb Mitchell with pity again. The diner waitress, Brenda Higgins, proudly framed a local newspaper article about him on the wall. But Caleb didn't buy a mansion, and he didn't buy sports cars. He used his newfound millions to hire the best environmental remediation teams in the country. They stripped away the poisoned topsoil, neutralized the chemicals Sterling had dumped, and planted thousands of native Douglas firs. Slowly, the birds returned. The grass grew back green and strong. On the exact spot where the ruined silo once stood, Caleb built a sprawling, state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility for retired military and police working dogs. It was a place where dogs who had seen too much war could come to run in the open fields, free of danger, free of noise. Caleb Mitchell finally got his peace and quiet. And every evening, as the sun set over the newly healed Oregon Valley, he would sit on his massive cedar porch with a cup of black coffee, watching Sarge patrol the green fields, guarding a fortune that they no longer needed, on a piece of earth that was finally home. If Caleb and Sarge's incredible journey from a forgotten wasteland to an $11 million victory inspired you, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another unbelievable real-life story. What would you do if you suddenly found a secret vault hidden right inside your own backyard? Let us know down below.